we are adopted into the USA, as long as we have been ushered in. So, we'll turn. Okay, going to go to my share screen now. I'll take it from here. And as I said, I'm going to take it intentionally not long. And go here. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to let me kind of wrap up. Start to talk about the people, the Jewish people, and the people of Israel as a people from the word Israel, and the land of Israel, land of the Jewish people. And I mentioned how it is ingrained from the very openings of the Bible to Abraham, where he says, go out of your land to the land I will show you. The very key point to Abraham, and it is all of being in the land, losing the land, returning the land, longing for the land. All right. By the way, at no point were we absolutely out of the land. There's one Jewish family, Zainati family, that had managed to retain their roots in the land of Israel uninterrupted to the modern times. And of course, we have an associated community of Samaritans, descendants of the north, who never left. They're not many, but they're there. So, and of course, then also, we know as Jews, it was in our prayers 3 times a day, in the Amida, plus in the Birkat Hamazon. You ate, you longed for the land of Israel. You gave God for the land, even though you didn't have it. And at every wedding ceremony, you're all familiar, the end of the wedding ceremony, the breaking of the glass, which is a call for Im eshkachech Yerushalayim, tishkach yemini. I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its cunning. And even though we were defeated in 70, and then there was the great crushing of the Jewish uprising in 135 in Bar Kokhba, and almost total genocide of the Jews inside the land of Israel by the Roman forces, still we were able to remain to some extent. Within a few decades, rebuilt the community. We were able to produce the Mishnah, the authoritative compendium for Jewish practice upon which Judaism is built. Then the Talmud Yerushalmi, the edition of the land of Israel, and later on the text of the Kabbalah, the Midrash, and the most widespread code of Jewish laws, Shulchan Aruch, all products of Jews living inside the land of Israel, when we are told the Jews were not in the land of Israel. Part of it is our fault. We keep on saying the land didn't have Jews. It had Jews. It didn't have big numbers, but it had. Jerusalem, by the way, had more Jews than up till the modern times, actually had more Jews than it had other peoples in it, in the old walled city. It did, actually. So, what kind of longing? The poet Yehuda Levi, great poet of Spanish pain and Spanish Spain, of the golden age of Spain, and the philosopher Yehuda Levi. Libi b'mizrach v'anochi b'sof ma'arav. My heart is in the east, and I sit in the end of the west. You couldn't get more further west than Spain in those days. You dropped off the end of the earth. Remember that. All right. How can I find savor in food? How shall it be sweet to me? How shall I render my vows, my bonds, while yet Zion lies beneath the fetter of Edom, and I in Arab chains? Zion is in the fetter of Edom. Rome, I guess it's during the Crusades. He's writing it when the land of Israel is under the Christian Crusaders, and he is under Arab chains, Kavle Arab. A light thing it would seem to me to leave all the goods of Spain, a beautiful, luxurious country. Jews had everything good. Seeing how precious in my eyes to behold the dust of the desolate sanctuary. I'd rather see the dust of the sanctuary than the delights of Spain. Legend has it that he made it to the land of Israel. He got to the old city, got to the wall, to the gates, and there at the gates he was run down by a horseman, dying of his last breath in the old city. So there are always also attempts to return. Saladin, during the Crusades, Jews had been expelled. Saladin called the Jews to come back in. He called the Christians to come back in. And then the Turkish sultans, I have Suleiman, but I think it was actually Muhammad, before him, Sultan Muhammad, who invited Jews to come in to the Turkish Empire and welcome Jews back into the land of Israel. In particular, and there was the great settlement in Sfat, Sfat, at that period. There were a wave of Hasidim that came in the 1700s. There was a wave of Yemenite Jews came in the 1880s. At the same time, the first modern wave of pre-Zionists came, Bilu, And there was the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, outside of Jerusalem by Moses Montefiore. All this starting before the rise of political Zionism. And my father's great-grandfather and mother sold all their possessions at the age of 80 and moved to Tzfat at that time, also 1880, 1881. The same time my wife's great-grandfather moved to Jerusalem, same year. It was murdered by marauders. That was the risk of being in the land of Israel at that time. If there wasn't the bandits around, not necessarily, terrorists, but bandits, then it was malaria or it was cholera, right? So many of these early pioneers died to be there, literally died to be there. So modern Zionism, we know, is a consequence of the fact that Europe could not tolerate its Jews in the modern nationalist movement environment, and that would repeat itself in the newly awakened nationalism of the Arab world. Parallel developments. So it began as a trickle, became a wave, and a flood, and all too well know, both Europe and the Middle East would be empty of their Jews, almost totally of their Jews. Middle East succeeded completely, almost completely, more than the Europeans did. Political movement in modern Zionism, as envisioned by Herzl, became essential to Jewish survival. It would override the belief of the Orthodox world that only God would bring about the return. We could no longer sit and wait. Remember I said about the rebellions, right? The Jews were passive in the Exodus. We could, right? And we could no longer remain passive. We could no longer. The very belief of the liberal and secular Jew that the new world of enlightenment and revolution would welcome the Jew with open arms, that was proven false with the Dreyfus affair and the Holocaust. And so we have then essentially that's central to identity of Jews as a people is connection with the land. Now we're into the 21st century. What we are waiting to see is if a large and identifiable Jewish community can be viable and vibrant outside of the land or disconnected from it. And that's going to be the great question in the 21st century. Obviously, the viability of Jewish people in the land of Israel no longer the problem that it was 50 years ago, where it was still a question mark. It's in place. Now the question is the viability of Jews outside the land of Israel. So that is just on Israel and the people. I just want to jump ahead. I'm not going to just get into my introduction here. What's cooking? Carmen, something good? That's pretty American. Okay. All right. So just into the introduction of the next chapter, and then I will let us go and break. Im ein kemach ein Torah. If there's no dough, there's no Torah. There's no Torah study on an empty stomach. So, so I have the concept of the people. Right? That's the three core concepts. All right. There's the people, there's the Torah, and there's God. I'm going in that order intentionally. All right. The opposite of what one might expect. Torah from the word hora'ah, teaching. A morah, moreh, teaches. What do they teach? Torah. They teach teaching. So the Bible, biblical Hebrew, the word Torah means a teaching. Al titosh do not abandon the teachings of your mother, Torah. Right? So this is the second key element of any discussion of Judaism is the concept of Torah. So now what do we mean by it, though? It's a teaching. What does that mean? Well, the three different meanings. There's the traditional concept of Torah shebichtav, which is what we have in written Torah, the Bible, 5 books of Moses, our half, not the Christian half. That's Tanakh. Then there's the idea of Torah shebaal peh, and that distinguishes us. That's the Torah that is transmitted orally. We call it Torah shebaal peh, meaning oral Torah, from teacher to student. We have the Pirkei Avot, the opening, Moshe Kibel Sinai, Torah Sinai. Moses receives the Torah at Sinai. Masirah Yeshua, he transmits it to Joshua, Joshua to the prophets and to the elders, and so on down. And we're the recipients of that transmission. And the belief that all that is created afterwards, including what I'm saying now, is a continuation of that first transmission of God to Moses, right? That. And so that distinguishes Judaism, for example, in rabbinic Judaism, from Karaism, which is parallel to us as Jews. They're Jews, but they're Jews who refuse to accept the traditions of the rabbis. They want to go back to the text of the Torah, right? Like the Protestants refused to accept the transmission, Masorah, of the Catholic Church, based on the same principle, and said sola scriptura, only to the scriptures. So, not many Karaites. And they, at one point, they were a powerful force within the Jewish community. They shriveled. They didn't develop a tradition of interpretation that kept them. It also distinguishes us from the Samaritans. I said, very parallel to us, the sense of the northern tribes. They only have the 5 books of Moses and Joshua, and then they have their own traditions. It distinguishes us from Christians because we share the first half, our side of the book, but we diverge when they talk about old and new, and we don't have an old and new. We got what we got. It also distinguishes us from Islam, which sees us as a forerunner, but not a forerunner directly to Islam, but as a reference point in the Quran to verify and elucidate what Muhammad is talking about. A little bit very different. So then we have the third idea, which is the Torah is not just a teachings written down and not just a parroting of what the sages have said, but also methodology. The concept, the core concept, shinantim levanecha, you shall teach your children, right? You shall be teaching. You use Torah and all the different tools of the rabbis over the centuries to define the truth. And that is the methodology then that has shaped the Jewish mind and Jewish behavior as well as any written text could. So today I'll just touch on the written Torah, and then the oral Torah and Jewish way of thinking we'll do next time. So written Torah, what do we mean when we talk about the written Torah? We should know. For Jews, it's divided up into 3 parts, 3 collection, the 3, we may say, we say Torah Nevi'im Ketuvim, so sort of wrote the Torah, 5 books of Moses, prophets, and the writings. So we know Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those 5 we know. So the first question we'll ask is, what's the authority for the Torah? Because that becomes the core for Jewish observance. There are few observances we take out of the other books of the Bible, but the core is inside the 5 books of Moses. That becomes the constitution, we might say. But what's the authority for that constitution? So we know very clearly, for Jews of antiquity, until very observant Jews still today, Moses wrote it, the words of God at Sinai. What we have is the written text, is what God dictated to Moses with some minor variations. Right? What do we have to go on? There are very little fragments still in existence of what may have been the original Torah. This is one of them. I put it up for you. I'm going to enlarge it. Let's see if I can get it. Yeah, there we go. And the Hebrew is a little bit difficult to read because there's the ancient, what's called the Canaanite script, Phoenician script, because we adopted the use of a block script that we took from the Babylonian captivity and adopted that. And if you can make it out, it says, Yivarechecha Hashem v'yishmerecha. Yeah, that's broken up, but that's what you can make up. Hashem panav elecha. Right? Sounds familiar. Right? So somebody had written what is the core of Birkat Kohanim, put it on I'm not sure if it was silver or gold, and rolled it up, and it was as a little amulet. It had been worn on the body, maybe placed somewhere in the house. The Ketef Chinom, that's the location where it was found. Somewhere around 6th century, it's while the first temple is still standing. So this would be the oldest piece that we have found, oldest piece. But what about the text? So in modern Jewish thought, we're aware that there are layers and layers in the text of the Torah. We're aware that there's redacting, there's editing that has gone on, some of which we may presume going back to Moses. Can we identify exactly? It's hard to say, but we can presume. What we can also presume some is actually older than Moses, because we have parallel texts from the ancient Middle East where the language is almost quotations, laws. and the laws rewritten to match a new way of thinking. So they are also in the Bible making reference to books that are lost to us. The famous example is the book that we presume is Deuteronomy, and the book of Kings talks about uncovering a book in the temple and reading it, and the people cry when they read it, and they bring it to the prophet Huldah to see, is it true? Is it the real book of Moses? And says, yeah, this is it, this is the real thing. And from the description, the way that they respond to it, we assume it is Deuteronomy, or at least a core part of Deuteronomy. But also, texts are not written always in antiquity. If it's really important, you memorize it. We're not used to that. Memorization was a very important function of education. We've gotten away from it. But in antiquity, oral traditions has a much greater weight than written traditions. And it continued well into the centuries after writing was widespread. For the time of the rabbis, writing down the rabbi's teaching was not permitted. It had to be memorized. And the belief was that a specialist in memorization was more accurate than the scribe, because when I've got it in writing, the scribe is copying, he's rushing, he's not paying attention, he uses abbreviations, he skips spaces, he skips lines, and we see these in ancient manuscripts all the time. So when they had it orally, they could go to the memorizer and say, who said this? And he would say, so-and-so said this. No, it cannot be so-and-so, because in another place we know we recorded that he said this. So think carefully. Then let's reword it so that it is in coordination. And so they could keep editing the oral, which they could not do with the written text. So once it's written down, and everybody's copying the same mistake. Right? Also, parchment expensive, space is expensive, like in the old days with computers when a bit was expensive on a computer. That's writing on parchment. You know, we had no chapters, no comments. So oral was much better. What we know is the text of the Torah as we have it appears sometime after the Babylonian captivity, brought officially by Ezra the scribe, is around 450, before the year 0. Got a middle section, Nevi'im, the prophets, right? Navi. The books aren't all books of the prophets. A big chunk of them are history, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. But it's because they cover a period of the early prophets, who are prophets of action, political action, and teaching, but not necessarily of writing. And then we have the written prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. We have 12, sometimes called the minor prophets, or Tresar, Hebrew word for 12. There's the whole list. And you see the breakdown of the books, right? What's important for the judges and kings is they told us how the Jewish people lived or did not live as loyal to the teachings of the children of Israel. And finally, the final books, the Ketuvim, the writings. That's the catch-all, the Kol Boinik, pot into which everything else is thrown in. And you can see the list. Psalms is there, Proverbs is there, Daniel is there, Chronicles, historic work, Ezra and Nehemiah. So that is where we get the Tanakh from Tanakh. So we should be aware of that. Okay. And we now have the creation of a unified text distributed, again, to Ezra and to the scholars around the time of Ezra, but it keeps on going till the time of Rabbi Akiva. Even they're still debating what to include, what not to include. But it's very clear that the core of it, the Egyptian pharaoh Ptolemy, a Greek pharaoh, was aware of it and wanted it and had it translated into Greek. This translation, the Shivim, the Septuagint. The Christian community has most of what we have by the time they start. So that means that we know we have a text of Torah around the 1st and 2nd century of the year 0. Right? And we need a coordinated text because we now have a Jewish community that goes from Gibraltar to the west, the end of the earth, all the way to the ends of the Persian Empire. Right? So we need to have a core code. That's it. Okay. And so just running up for you here, the oldest manuscript of the Torah, of the full Bible. It's the Codex, Aleppo Codex, or Keter Aron Solva. You can see the text inside has notes. Those notes are indicating what changes were made or kept into it. There's another one, a complete code called the Leningrad Codex. It's not as old, but it has the entire Bible as we have it. So we're looking at 930 and 1000. All right. And what's more interesting is what we did not include. Wonderful books like Ben Sira, Maccabees 1 and 2, Tobit, many, many more. The Catholics preserved them. Thank God for the Catholics. For the Catholics, we got our Apocrypha, we have Josephus. We appreciate it. We appreciate it. We had like secondhand versions with legends, but not the originals. And then, of course, we had things like the Dead Sea Scrolls commentary on Habakkuk, Manual of Discipline, Book of the Wars of Sons and Light against the Sons of Darkness. And it's from that we understand how the ancient Christian community had elements that were very similar to these Dead Sea people and so on. And so there's a fragment from the Dead Sea Scrolls from Genesis, Bereshit. Let's bring that up to you. So that is our written Torah as it begins. So, okay, next we go into the oral. What is that oral Torah? What does it mean to have an oral Torah? What does it mean to have a spoken transmission as opposed to just a fixed written text? So with that, I'm going to wrap up. Any questions? No, everybody's on good behavior. Go ahead. Oh, I think they found somebody older than Lucy. Yeah. So still in transition. Yeah. So it's a good question. We didn't have to wait for Lucy. It happened when we had the first discoveries of Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal and could date it long before 5,807 years. Right. Well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It was very clear. It was already very clear already a century and a half ago as people were beginning archaeological exploration. And Darwin blew everything up, of course. Yeah, yeah. So it really doesn't matter about Lucy. It doesn't matter. But once you accept the idea that it takes time to create human beings as we have it, then that's it. So a lot of rabbis decided, even among Orthodox rabbis, they said, you'll find among Orthodox rabbis, very Orthodox rabbis, decide and say, the act of creation is not of our interest. The details of creation, the details of the details of how human beings are formed is not of our interest. What is of our interest is now how does this first human that can identify as a human being, who is able to make a judgment and rebel, that's from the point that we are interested. Everything else is irrelevant. It's an old Jewish position. How the world is created, how the universe is created is not Jewish matter. We couldn't care less. You see this in old rabbinic sources as well. That's not our problem. Our problem is from the existence of a human being, as we can understand a human being, to our times. That's what counts. Yeah, I say it's from the moment that a human being that is a recognizable human being that has a moral character and is able to follow good and evil. And from that moment, that's where our interest is. Everything else before that is irrelevant. Yeah. So Lucy is irrelevant. You understand? The process of getting there is not a Jewish issue. It's now that we have a human being. So what's very interesting is this dating. If you look at the dating, the 5,800 and so on, it's very close to the first existence of organized communities as opposed to wanderers, just wanderers, where first human beings are gathering in collective societies. And the timing, it is, if you also look at it, within the generation after Adam, you have first tool making, first music instruments. In other words, the beginnings of civilization, as we can begin to understand it, that is where the Adam starts. Everything before that is whipped cream. And the rabbis go in and say, look, the human beings have a tail when they were begun. So there's a story, yeah, the human beings had a tail, and God thought it wasn't nice, so he removed the tail. Same thing. So again, as I say, the science is not the Jewish issue. I mean, we're not going to float off the air and, into the air or something like that. Our issue is the moral issue. Our issue is the spiritual issue. Which is now that they have a human being. And of course, also behind it, as the rabbi sees, underlying the story of Genesis is organization and system of creation rather than chaos. So that's a faith issue. So are we now as a result of chaos or as a result of organization? And the pagans said we're the result of chaos. And the religionist says, no, we're out of something intelligent. That's intelligent design. So now we can get into this fight among scientists and evolutionists. Is there intelligent design? Is there not intelligent design? Is that really a concept that works intelligent? That's a different issue. But the idea that we are a product of chaos, the Bible can say, no, there is no chaos. God does not play dice with the universe. That's what Einstein's famous quote. Okay. The Greek stories of creation are pretty chaotic. Eventually it comes to be, but but the gods are fighting with themselves. They're fighting against the gods. And before the gods, there's Cronus, and there's the gods are an outcome of existence rather than the cause of existence. That's it. Yeah. Also in Hindu thought, the gods are the outcome of what is, not rather than being the creators of what is. Themselves are outcome of what is. Yeah. So somewhere in this, there's a pattern. I don't think go into this debate that you can say, is there a pattern in the existence of the atom? Is there a pattern in the subatomic particles, right? Is there a pattern in the concept of DNA that enables it to replicate in such a position that would create a variety of living beings, right? So you can go into that, right? But no chaos. Jews don't believe in chaos. We create a lot of chaos among ourselves, but we don't believe in chaos. That's it. Underlying the chaos, there has to be a plan. There has to be a unity. That's it. Okay, yeah. That's why the second chapter is the opposite of the first chapter, if you ever read it. But it is in a way the beginning, even though it's an attempt to found human civilization in the question of the desire of the human being, the ability of the human being to discern, the ability of the human being to think, and the ability of the human being to make moral judgments. And that's where we start. Yeah. So the first chapter is a very nice human being. Second chapter, the human being messes it all up. Yeah. Two different stories of creation. Completely different stories of creation. Chapter 1, chapter 2. So that's in in chapter 2. Yeah. In chapter 1, there's this stratification, which actually stratification makes perfect sense on an evolutionary basis. It is the material, planetary, vegetation, sea life, land life, and then completely separate the human being. Right. So positing the human being becomes an entity, is an entity completely different from the animal life that precedes. All right, and now we can get into great debate. Is the human being really essentially the same as any other animal or different? The DNA is almost the same, right? And yet, there's no flea that wrote Shakespeare. Same DNA. Okay, there we got to that. So that's where we can debate. Yeah.
I think that what's interesting is that the starting of the Bible comes without the definition of
Without a definition. Oh, day. Yeah. So it's So even. Yeah.
We understand today.
Yeah. Yeah. So the rabbis go into this discussion. How should we consider a day? That it is 1,000 years is but a wink of an eye in your sight. So time is all relative to the situation that we're in. That's what Einstein said. If we're sitting still, time is forever. No, it's the opposite. If we're sitting still, time seems to go fast. If we're moving fast, time doesn't move. All right? There we go. That's it. Huh? Yeah. Okay. So everybody have a good Shabbos. Have a good Shabbos. Yeah.